Hi everyone, I am the Healthy Dad, and in this video I'll be showing you how to make life-changing bread, otherwise known as Einkorn sourdough sandwich bread. If you'd like to learn more about why this bread is so good, then click the link in the video description to be directed to the All About Wheat page on my website. In a nutshell, there are three key reasons why this bread is the best. Number one is that we're using 50% freshly ground flour, which means this bread is full of nutrients, with one important example being vitamin E, otherwise known as tocopherol. When translated, this word means to bear offspring, because tocopherol happens to play an important role in reproductive efficiency. And it turns out that freshly ground wheat is our most readily available source of this vitamin. Number two is this is a naturally leavened bread with real sourdough starter, which in simple terms means that this bread is much more digestible. Many dietary issues related to wheat can either be reduced or gotten rid of altogether by properly preparing the grains. And number three is we're using einkorn wheat, which is an ancient grain known to be very low in gluten, but very high in many essential dietary and trace minerals. So now that you understand why you should be making this amazing, life-changing bread, let's get right to it and show you how.
So we're going to get started here with the Einkorn sourdough sandwich bread. The ingredients for the recipe are einkorn wheat berries, einkorn all-purpose flour, butter, sugar, salt, of course some water, and a freshly fed sourdough starter. The Pullman loaf pan you see there is the large size that is available on Amazon. I highly recommend getting this pan because it gives consistent, excellent results, and it is specific to this recipe in terms of the amount of ingredients. So to start off, we're going to do 2 cups of einkorn wheat berries in your whatever grinder you have. I happen to be using the Vitamix blender to grind my flour because that's what I already have and it works pretty well. Though if you get a chance, I would recommend checking out the Wonder Mill. Amazon has it for about $3.26. This is going to give much better results and more consistent quality, even all the way to pastry flour on the grind setting. So definitely check that out if you can. Now I want to point out here that the texture of the freshly ground flour is going to be different from any other flour because the natural oils in the wheat berries are still present. Those are vital nutrients and very important for us to get in our normal diet. So that's why we're making the sandwich bread with as much freshly ground flour as possible. Moving on, the next step after grinding is getting the sourdough starter ready. We're going to add some water to it, quite a bit of water, and we're going to whisk that up to kind of froth it up. We want to kind of activate that yeast and get it ready to mix with the fresh flour, which is what we're going to do here. 403 grams we go with, and just give it a nice mix. Don't want to go too crazy with it, but we give it a nice mix and then cover it, and we're going to let that sit usually overnight. That's the easiest way to do it in my experience. 8 to 12 hours is about right, even longer if you need to. This is what you want your sponge or levain to look like the next day. You want to have those bubbles on the surface. Those are very important because they indicate that the dough is risen sufficiently to move to the next step. So now we want to take out our Pullman loaf pan and get a little bit of butter in your hand. Go ahead and grease it up on all sides so that the bread doesn't stick. Next up, we're going to start what's called our slurry. These are the primary ingredients in the slurry. We have butter, sugar, salt. The next thing we're going to do is start this flour roux. It's kind of just like making gravy. We're going to throw in some flour, turn the heat on medium, and add 195 grams of water. Now, basically, it takes 2 or 3, maybe 4 minutes, and we're going to continue stirring, trying to get all those lumps out until we get a nice, smooth gravy consistency. If there are a few lumps left over, don't worry about it. It doesn't matter. We got that nice warm water roux, or flour roux rather. It's going to mix up into this slurry and form the binding base for our sandwich bread. So we're going to mix that into the sponge that we made the day before, or it's also called a levain. Give it a nice whip, and then we're going to take the all-purpose einkorn flour and mix that right in. We'll start it off by hand. We just want to mix it up a bit before we switch it over to the KitchenAid mixer. Once we transfer it, we're going to do 2 minutes on setting 2 with the KitchenAid. You want to note here that the dough is going to look a little bit soupy when you're finished, but that is perfectly normal with einkorn flour breads. They're just a little bit more hydrated than most. Next step is to sprinkle a little bit of flour on top to prevent this from sticking while we're transferring it to the loaf pan. You just kind of want to scrape around the sides and let the flour get all over the dough. And you may notice that it starts to look more like a typical dough consistency at this point. Then we want to flip the dough into the loaf pan, and we want to flour our hand up to prevent it from sticking, and then we're going to push it down as evenly as possible throughout the pan. Feel free to make it pretty by pushing the edges down. And then we're going to cover it up with plastic wrap for the rising process. And this is going to rise for anywhere from 3 to 4 hours, or even longer, depending on how active your sourdough starter was. This is about halfway through. It's probably been a couple hours. The dough's definitely starting to come up. And this is fully risen. And finally, before we stick this in the oven, we want to go ahead and score the top with a very sharp razor blade. You want to do this to prevent bubbles from forming on the crust while it's baking. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of the crust falling off when you go to slice it. Then we're going to throw this in the oven at 400 degrees for exactly 16 minutes. And then we're going to reduce it to 350 and bake for an additional 18 minutes. This is what it looks like when it's done baking. We're going to let that cool for about 5 minutes before you flip it out onto a wire rack. And here we want to let it cool for about 1 to 2 hours to seal in the moisture in the bread. After that, we're going to cut the loaf in half and put each half into a bread bag, where they're going to sit overnight, which is going to really help to develop the crust and get it ready for slicing. Now, when you're slicing, there are 2 things you're really going to want. One is an excellent carving knife or slicing knife, and the other is going to be a really nice bread guide or a slicing guide that's going to help you cut this in even slices. Once the bread is all cut up, you have 2 options for storing. The first being on the counter at room temperature, where the bread will keep for about 7 to 10 days. The other is going to be to freeze it, where it'll keep for 8 to 10 weeks or longer and stay as fresh as it was the day you baked it. The only caveat being that you really have to toast the bread once it's been frozen, which is going to bring the moisture and the freshness right back into the bread. And here we have the finished product. This beautiful einkorn sourdough sandwich bread loaf is full of nutrients. It's nice and moist, has perfect crumb, and you should definitely give it a try. And one final shot here, the toasted and buttered sandwich bread with a little bit of PB&J. I thought this shot really just showcases the crumb and the moistness in an exceptional way. So there you have it.